So let me begin. The prologue of the human condition is a text that really sets up the book around two themes and a major question. The two themes are earthliness and earth alienation, and thus the question of science and how science alienates human beings from the earth and thus from their human condition, because as she will say, earth is the quintessence of the human condition. And the second is the question of the automation of labor and what that means to our understanding of the human condition, specifically the elevation of labor and thus life over action and meaning as the center of what it means to be human in the modern world. Those are the two themes. The question is, to the extent we are at risk of losing or transforming the human condition as it's been understood for 2,000 years or more, what should we do? And her answer is not to give an answer, but to say we should think about it, and that thinking about it matters. And so thinking becomes her response. And this book is an attempt to think the question and the answer. So having said that, let me just begin. She begins with this story or this event of the launch of Sputnik, the Soviet satellite. And what she says on page 1 is that this event, second in importance to no other, not even to the splitting of the atom, would have been greeted with unmitigated joy if it had not been for the uncomfortable military and political circumstances attending to it. So, one thing to note is just the somewhat shocking claim that the launch of Sputnik is the most important event of the modern era, more so than the splitting of the atom, something that I think would be quite controversial at her time, and I imagine still today. And her point is, it would have been embraced with joy. Why? Because it represents the human's ability, and it stands for the ability of mankind to leave the earth, to flee the earth. And she says that this desire to flee the earth has been central to the human wish and the human condition for millennia. And why is that? I want to, the key to this part is the two paragraphs on page 2 to 3, and I want to read those carefully with you and offer an explanation of what she's doing. So she says on page 2, the earth is the very quintessence of the human condition, and earthly nature, for all we know, may be unique in the universe in providing human beings with a habitat in which they can move and breathe without effort and without artifice. So earth is the quintessence, it's the highest essence, it's the quintessential essence of what it means to be human. Not human nature. I want to be clear about that, and we'll talk about that. She'll distinguish the human condition from human nature in the next chapter, chapter 1. But in brief, human nature means there's something natural or essential in sort of the DNA and the idea of what it means to be human, that if we lose, we're no longer human. That's not her argument. The human condition is that humans live in a world we make ourselves. This is the word artifice. So we live in a world without artifice. And the next sentence, the human artifice of the world. The idea is that humans make the world they live in, and the world they live in conditions them. And the human condition is the conditions of humans and humanity in the world we have built over the last 2,000 years or more. So she's saying the earth is the quintessence of the human condition, and Sputnik represents the flight from the earth. Well, what is the earth, and why is it the human condition? The next sentence reads, the human artifice of the world separates human existence from all mere animal environment I'll stop there for 1 second. The human artifice of the world separates human existence from animal environment. Humans, unlike animals, can make and artificially create the world in which they live. Animals live in a world that's largely given to them. Of course, ants can build ant holes, and other animals can dig holes or build somewhat, do things, but they can't radically change the natural world. Humans are the one group that through intelligence and technology can actually come together and build cities, reroute rivers, and even make artificial realities. And that is what she's talking about. We can create stories, we can create languages that make the world appear and be differently. And so she says the human artifice of the world separates human existence from all mere animal environment. But life itself is outside this artificial world, and through life, man remains related to all other living organisms. This is absolutely central. What this says is that humans are different from animals insofar we are artificial and artificing. We make the world we live in. And yet we are connected to the rest of living beings, animals, insofar as we are alive like all other animals. And that livingness, that being alive, is outside the artificial world. That's just something that we're born. It's given to us. It's not something we can create. And for 2,500 years, this divide between our artificial humanity, our artificial ability to create a world which distinguishes our humanity, and our being thrown into a created world like all other animals, has been the nature of the human condition. We are split beings, both animal and human. And this goes way back to the Greeks and to Sophocles in his Ode to Man, where man is called Deinon, which means both wondrous and horrible. And it stands for this idea that man is wondrous in that he can remake his world, and also horrible in that in remaking the world he can end it. But what she's saying here is there was always a limit. There were things we couldn't remake, like birth and death and life, which connected us to the earth. The earthliness is this life element. So to continue, for some time now, a great many scientific endeavors have been directed toward making life also artificial, toward cutting the last tie through which even man belongs among the children of nature. She's here talking about genetic engineering, test tube babies, things that would allow us not simply to artificially create the political world we live in and the social world we live in, but to remake humans, to, in a sense, make humans artificial as opposed to natural beings. She's writing this back in 1958, or it's published in 58. But what she's talking about is a dream to remake and to be able to make and improve human beings and thus the human condition. And so what's going on here is she's saying the earth is the quintessence of the human condition, that we are alive, that there's something about humans which we can't control, which is not artificial. And yet for some time now, we've been trying to make that too artificial. And then she talks about exactly this. It is the desire to escape from the imprisonment to the earth that is manifest in the attempt to create life in the test tube, in the desire to mix frozen germplasm from people of demonstrated ability under the microscope to produce superior human beings, and to alter their size, shape, and function. And the wish to escape the human condition, I suspect, also underlies the hope to extend man's lifespan far beyond the 100-year limit. What this means is that just like people, I don't know how many of you are aware of what transhumanism is, or people like Ray Kurzweil, who think that humans are going to merge with machines in some sort of cyborg future. But the idea of them is that as we become more and more like machines and we implant not only drugs, but chips and nanotechnology blood cells in ourselves, we will be able to, in a sense, cure all disease and live forever. It's the same desire that leads to test tube babies. It's the same desire to lead to super cybernetic races. And what Arendt is saying is it's the same desire that sends Sputnik into space. It's the desire to, in a sense, lose and leave behind our earthly and our biological limitations and be able to fully create an artificial world. And though now to continue on to the next paragraph, which he really brings the force of this to its conclusion, this future man, whom the scientists tell us they will produce in no more than 100 years, seems to be possessed by a rebellion against nature, against human existence, as it has been given, a free gift from nowhere, secularly speaking, which he wishes to exchange, as it were, for something he has made himself. The point here is very clear and very important. It's that for 2,500 years, humans and the human condition has been such that as much as we could change our world and artifice our world and artificially improve our world, there were limits. There was a human existence that was given that we couldn't change. And it had to do with life, and it had to do with the earthliness, and it had to do that we were on earth living biological beings. But we are now suddenly possessed of a technological ability to rebel against that earthliness, against the idea that life is a free gift from nowhere. So she says, secularly speaking, if you were religious, it would be a free gift from God. But if you're secularly speaking, it's just fortune or fate. And we want to exchange that free gift from nowhere, that fate, for something we make ourselves. What she's saying is that Sputnik represents, just like test tube babies represent, just like today transhumanism and the desire to live forever and the desire to control our bodies and to create medicine that will allow us to live infinitely. All this represents a rebellion against the earthliness of human existence, that it is a given, that there's something given. And we want to, in a sense, remake it. Why? Because it's not good enough. We want to live longer. We want to live healthier. We want to live faster. We want to live more just. We want to live in a way in which we don't run into the limitations of our biology, and we don't want to run into the limitations of the environment. And if we can digitize our bodies and live both virtually but also part cyborg-wise, like the bionic man, we can improve him. We can make us better. And she's saying this is the drive that Sputnik represents. And this drive to leave behind our nature and become purely artificial is the most important drive of the 20th century and of what she calls the modern age. The next sentence reads, "There is no reason to doubt our abilities to accomplish such an exchange, just as there is no reason to doubt our present ability to destroy all organic life on Earth." Right? Just like nuclear weapons could destroy all human life on Earth, there's no reason to doubt that we will eventually be able to replace biological earthly life with some sort of machine hybrid, technical, artificial human life. She wrote this in 1958, and she says scientists say it would happen in about 100 years, which would be about 2058. Those of you who read Ray Kurzweil and his book, The Singularity is Near, may know that he predicts that this full, complete merging of humans and machines, such that we will create a new species, which is not human, but transhuman, should happen between 2050 and 2060. Okay, it's just coincidence, But it is somewhat shocking that Arendt had the dates quite close, if you believe Kurzweil today. The question then she asks is only whether we wish to use our new scientific and technical knowledge in this direction, and this question cannot be decided by scientific means. It is a political question of the first order, and therefore can hardly be left to the decision of professional scientists or professional politicians. So what she's saying here is this question of whether we want to, in a sense, remake the human condition and turn ourselves into artificial beings is not a scientific question. Science will probably be able to do it at some way, and in some way it may not be perfect, there may be mistakes, but enough of it will be able to happen. It's a political question. We have to decide, do we want it? Do we want to do this to ourselves? And the point that she wants to make here is that if we don't ask the question, it will be decided for us because we're continuing down the road. Every year, we come closer and closer to this. You now all have iPhones or something in your pockets, which make your brain, which are an appendage to your brain. I have a former student who's currently working on chips that will go into your brain that will, in a sense, turn and have the iPhone implanted in your brain. People will work on inserting neural networks into you so that your reactions will be faster and will be better. And you can say, I will resist that. I don't want that. It won't happen to me. But the truth is, if everybody else is doing it, you're at a huge disadvantage if you don't. And so Kurzweil, who I don't always agree with, but I think he makes strong points, what he says is anyone who decides to not augment themselves technologically will become like the one-eyed jacks in Brave New World. They'll become like the people who are, in a sense, we keep in museums or zoos around as evidence of a lower species that we once were in the past. I'm not saying that will happen, but what I think Arendt is saying is that's the direction, that's actually what we want. She's saying that's the direction we are moving in unless we decide to stop. And so that's what she means is it's a political question. And what she says in the next paragraph, which I won't read the whole of, is that we need to realize that this is happening. And we need, she says, to start thinking about it. And so about halfway down the paragraph, she says, we do not yet know whether this situation is final, but it could be that we, who are earthbound creatures and have begun to act as though we were dwellers of the universe, namely, we've begun to act not as earthbound creatures, but as universal creatures, as creatures who exist in this non-earthly, artificial, completely scientific, technological world, that we will forever be unable to understand, that is to think and speak about the things which nevertheless we're able to do. I mean, we all know this. When you get into an airplane, most of you don't know how it flies. You just trust that it will. In all honesty, most pilots today don't know how it flies. They just press buttons. When we use our computer, most of us don't know how it works. The knowledge of our world is so complicated that very few specialists can know how any particular thing we work. None of us know how most of the things we use in the world are and how they work. And so she says, knowledge and thought have parted company. We now are not able to think humanly about what we do. And we've become, she says, slaves to our machines, or we are at risk of becoming slaves to our machines. This isn't to say that the machines are going to, talk to each other and take over. That's not her point. Her point is that in order to do the newest medicine, in order to keep people alive, in order to fix the environment, we are going to have to rationalize our actions according to computer simulations, which we can't possibly understand. And so we will become slaves to our computer-driven, technologically driven, non-humanly comprehensible knowledge. And that's already happening. And what she says is that this technological language is a language that can't be put into human speech. It's so highly technical and mathematical that only very few people can understand it, and it becomes something separate from what you and I can have a dinner conversation about, and we lose our ability to actually intelligently and thoughtfully discuss the fate of the world. And the question that she wants to raise is, should we do this? Should we let this happen? The second part of the prologue, that's shorter but is also important, is on automation. And it starts on page 4, where she says, closer at hand, and perhaps equally decisive, is another no less threatening event. So if Sputnik and the rise of Earthlessness is one threatening event of the modern age, automation is the second. This is the advent of automation, which in a few decades probably will empty the factories and liberate mankind from its oldest and most natural burden, the burden of laboring and the bondage to necessity. So a number of scholars have said she was wrong about this because the factories haven't been emptied a few decades after 1958. Others have suggested that she was just a couple decades too early. There are many people, as I'm sure you know, who think that the current information data age with the rise of robots and intelligent artificial machines is doing that now. Certainly, there are a number of very smart economists who think we're entering an age in which the vast majority of human people will be economically superfluous in the next decade or so. And this raises huge political questions for, obviously, human rights issues. If people are economically superfluous, do we keep them around, and what do they do? But Arendt is raising a slightly different question here. She's saying that, here, I'll read the next sentence and then I'll say what she's saying. Here too, she says, a fundamental aspect of the human condition is at stake, namely that we are people who labor. We are people who produce the things we need to live. Thus, we help keep ourselves alive. But we are rebelling against labor. We don't want to labor. And this has been true for ages, right? We always have wanted to reduce the amount we have to labor, but we never could reduce it completely. But the rebellion against labor, the wish to be liberated from labor's toil and trouble, this is Marx, is not modern, but as old as recorded history. Freedom from labor itself is not new. It once belonged among the most firmly established privileges of the few. Only the few could free themselves from labor. They could have slaves, or they could have servants, or they could have workers. In this instance, though, in the modern age, it seems as though scientific progress and technical developments had only been taken advantage of to achieve something about which all former ages dreamed, but which none had been able to realize. Namely, we can finally do what everyone wanted. We can make the world better by freeing ourselves from labor. However, she says this is only in appearance. The modern age has carried with it a theoretical glorification of labor and has resulted in a factual transformation of the whole society into a laboring society. What she means is when anyone asks you, oh, who are you? What do you do? Most people say, oh, here's my job. I'm a professor. I run the Hannah Arendt Center. Our lives and the way we publicly ascribe significance to our lives are largely related to the question of what we do, our labor. We no longer usually say, I'm a Jew, or I'm a Christian, or I'm a Muslim, although some people do have important religious aspects of their lives. The point is that when we think about how we want to fulfill ourselves in the world, how we want to be meaningful, the only real publicly meaningful responses through our career or through our labor. So she says the fulfillment of the wish, therefore, namely to free ourselves from labor, like the fulfillment of wishes in fairy tales, comes at a moment when it can only be self-defeating. If what makes us meaningful is that we find fulfillment in labor, and yet we now can free ourselves from labor, we defeat ourselves. We lose what makes us meaningful. And this is part of the problem with welfare and with workfare and the debates around people today, which is there are plenty of jobs out there, people say, but they're boring, menial, often degrading jobs that don't pay very much. And people don't want them. They want to find meaning in their lives. And what Arendt is coming to say is that we are a society of labors, which is about to be liberated from the fetters of labor. And this society does no longer know of those other things and higher things and more meaningful activities for the sake of which this freedom would deserve to be won. We no longer have the religious, familial, ethical, inner lives that would make living meaningful once we free ourselves from labor. Marx, as some of you know, said that once we free people from labor, they'll be freed to hunt in the morning and read poetry at night. Arendt says, no, when we free them from labor, we free them to consume more and more and work more and more, even though they don't need to, because there's nothing they find more meaningful than consuming. She says that in the section on labor, which we'll get to in a couple weeks. So her idea is that we live in a laboring society where the only thing that provides us meaning is labor, and yet we're at the point of freeing ourselves from labor. And thus at the end of the paragraph she writes, what we are confronted with is the prospect of a society of laborers without labor, that is, without the only activity left to them, and surely nothing could be worse. So these are the two events that she says define what she calls the modern age, the loss of earthliness and the rise of automation. Thus, the rebellion against our inefficiencies and our biological limits and our earthly limits on the one hand, and a rebellion against our need to work and labor on the other, yet at a time when the only thing that makes our lives meaningful in a public way and gives us public significance is labor. And so she then ends this prologue with this chapter, with this paragraph, these paragraphs. She says, to these preoccupations and perplexities, right, to these questions, to these difficult questions that I've just raised, this book does not offer an answer. I'm not going to tell you what we should do. Such answers are given every day, and they are matters of practical politics, subject to the agreement of many. We have to persuade each other and come to an agreement. That's what politics is for Hannah Arendt. It's not about truth. It's about persuasion and agreement. But these answers can never lie in theory, in theoretical considerations, which is why philosophy can never provide answers to politics. It can't be the opinion of one person. All she wants to do, she says, what I propose in the following is a reconsideration of the human condition from the vantage point of our newest experiences and our most recent fears. These two newest experiences, right? The Sputnik and the loss of the attempt to lose our earthliness and our biological limits, and the loss of labor, and our most recent fears. Well, what are those fears? I think the fears are that we may succeed, and in doing so, radically alter who we are, what the human condition is, in a way that we don't really know what it will bring. And then she writes, this obviously is a matter of thought, right? We have to think about it. And thoughtlessness, the heedless recklessness or hopeless confusion or complacent repetition of truths which have become trivial and empty, seems to me among the outstanding characteristics of our time. We all speak in cliches. We all repeat truths. We all say, oh, you know, big data is coming. Privacy is being lost. You know, oh, the world stinks. Oh, you know, there's no good jobs. We repeat these truths, but we don't think about them. We don't think, what do they mean? what's really going on. And so she says, what I propose is very simple in this book. It is nothing more to think than to think what we are doing. And this is one of her favorite phrases, to think what we are doing. It's every one of her books has a line like this in it, where she says, I'm not going to provide answers, I'm going to think. And that's what the rest of this book is about. Attempt to think what we are doing around these two questions, these two perplexities. And she says, we're going to deal, the central theme of this book is what we are doing, and it deals with the most elementary articulations of the human conditions within the range of every human being, which she will call labor, work, and action. What she means is that for 2,500 years, all human beings have been able to labor, that is to work, to labor, to struggle and toil, to make food and shelter and the things that allow them to live. They've been able to work, which means to create lasting objects like houses and tools and artworks that, and even cities and states and politics that change the nature of our world. Stories would be something along those lines too, artworks, whether they're fictional or material. And we're able to act, which means we're able to do things that are so interesting and surprising and extraordinary that the people around us stop and take notice. And because they stop and take notice, and they tell stories about what we did, and they make memorials to what we did, the world, the artificial world we're in, changes. And what she's saying is these three basic attributes of the human condition have been part of what it means to be human for the last 2,500 years, and they're all in danger of being lost now. And we need to think, do we want to do this? What are we doing? And that's what this book is about. So that's the prologue to the human condition. It sets out the themes and perplexities that we'll be talking about. I figure I've talked for about 35 minutes. I'll stop here and